In my family, we did what we were told. My parents are super traditional, and not listening was never an option. When my mom or dad said to do something or not do something, me and my brother and sister always listened. We learned that lesson the hard way. My dad was especially hard on my brother. I guess it was just the pressure of being a boy and my dad feeling like he wanted to raise a manly man, not a boyish man. He was all about not showing emotion, not crying, and never, ever showing pain. That all seemed ridiculous to me, but he was who he was. And I'm guessing, although I never knew them, that his parents were the same way with him. That's usually the way it goes, right? The sins of the father visited upon the son, and down the line. My mom was a little better, but only slightly, because her role was to listen to my dad. If he said jump, she asked how high. He was the boss of the family, no doubt about it. I remember when money was particularly tight one Christmas. My mom had suggested she get a little retail job to help out. But no, my dad would have nothing to do with it. He said, "No wife of mine is going to work. Your place is at home with the kids, cooking the meals, cleaning the house, and doing the shopping." My mom didn't even know how to drive. We would have to hoof it down the hill to the grocery store and carry everything back up the hill by hand. We sometimes took backpacks and filled them up with what we bought. My mom also used my old stroller to fill up. In the winter, that was tough. Pushing a stroller through snow or even just dealing with the cold was making it very tough getting up and down that hill. My mom had the nerve to suggest that she get her driver's license one night during dinner. And the string of swears that let fly from my dad's mouth shocked me to my core. I was a junior high student at the time, but I think I learned a couple new swears. I was the youngest of us 3 kids, so when my brother and sister had both moved out, which they did as soon as they possibly could, I was on my own with the parents. Dinner time was torture. I could avoid my dad pretty well during other times of the day, but that family dinner was mandatory, and I hated it. We had to sit there listening to my dad telling us all about his boring day, and if anyone else dared to talk about theirs, that would be it. We smiled and nodded, but the whole thing was just so phony to me. When I was 17 and in my second last year of high school, we fell on particularly hard times. My dad had gotten laid off. He then had the great idea to try and start his own landscaping business, so he went to the bank for a loan. It was a big loan. My dad thought he knew everything there was to know about everything, but he most certainly did not. I don't even know if he did any research about how to start a business or how to keep it going. To make a long story short, he was in the hole within 6 months. The business was a flop. I tried to talk to him a bit about marketing and such, but he didn't want to hear anything about it. He acted as though he was the only landscape business around and that people would be lucky to hire him. When the bank started phoning all the time and then the collection agencies, we just stopped answering the phone. One day there was a knock on the door. It was our landlord telling us that we hadn't paid rent for 3 months. We had 2 weeks to come up with some money, or we were getting kicked out. My mom was beside herself with worry. My dad was too proud to actually write home and ask for some help from his aging parents. So he said we had to find another way to come up with some money for the landlord. A couple days later, we were out for a walk when we ran into my dad's old boss. He seemed nice enough, but a little snobby. My dad told us about him over dinner on his first day on the job. He told us that he owned 3 businesses and was living the American dream. He hadn't come from much, but had made himself into a success. I think that's who my dad was modeling himself after with his big business idea. My dad chatted with him for a while about hard times and catching up, and my mom and I walked over to a bench and sat down. I could see the boss kept looking over at me, and more than once, I noticed my dad would turn and look at me too. They were definitely talking about me, and it was making me very uneasy. When my dad and his old boss parted ways, there was something different about my dad. I couldn't put my finger on it. There was just some kind of shift, and I knew enough to know he was hatching some scheme inside his mind. Little did I know, though, that this scheme would include me. That night, I was woken up by my parents arguing. Well, more like my dad yelling. I tried to piece the argument together as I was sure it had to do with why he kept looking over at me while talking to his boss. The next morning, as I was getting ready for school, my dad told me to come sit next to him on the couch. In all my 17 years, I couldn't remember a single time of my dad actually wanting me to come closer to him or spend time with him. My fears from the day before were rising to the top. He was being too nice, speaking too softly. He started by asking me if I was grateful for all the sacrifices he and my mom had made for me, my brother, and my sister. At that moment, I was so envious that they were long gone and I was stuck here. He told me that my boss was a really nice guy with a lot of money. He told me that although they had lots of money, the one thing they wanted more than anything was a baby. I guess they had tried IVF, but it hadn't worked. Then they tried surrogacy, where they paid someone to carry a baby for them. But that person had flaked and changed her mind 3 months before the due date. I guess the guy's wife had sunk into quite the depression after that. He had promised her that he would find someone else to carry a baby to term for them and then give it up to them. At this point, I still couldn't begin to understand what all this had to do with me. Then he got to the point. He told him that his old boss had made him an offer the day before when they were talking in the park. The boss had told my dad how pretty I was and what good genes we all had. He offered my dad $200,000 if he could get me to carry his baby for him and then give it up to him and his wife for adoption when it was born. My mouth was hanging open in shock. I suddenly understood the fight I had heard last night and why my mom was nowhere to be seen during this conversation. She didn't agree with it, but wasn't strong enough to say no or to stand up to him. I started to cry. I didn't know what to do. My dad laid it on thick. "Think of your mother," he said. "Think of what that money could do for us. Think of what it could do for you. If you agree to this, we'll put a big chunk away to send you to college." That was where he knew he would get me. I wanted nothing more than to get an education and get out of this one-horse town. Most of all, I wanted far away from my dad and his domineering ways. He told me that he would be on the street if I didn't do this. He had to pay back the bank, plus the landlord, not to mention food and clothing. I went to school that day and could think of little else. I had never been with anyone in that way, and this would not be the kind of first time I was wanting. Part of the deal was that I would get pregnant the old-fashioned way, which meant I would have to sleep with my dad's old boss. Ugh. That night when I got home, I talked to my mom about it. She obviously knew, but felt too horrible to mention it. She cried along with me and said she wished she had more power or could do something more. I had already agreed to do it in my mind. I wanted to get out, go to college, help my mom, and I really couldn't think of another way out of this huge financial mess. When I told my dad that I would do it, he said I had made the right choice, the only choice. He went on and on about how important it was to help family if you could, and I couldn't help but think bitterly how little he had ever really done for us. For a time, he had brought home a paycheck, but even that was short-lived, and he had certainly never given us any kind of love or affection. He was in the middle of talking to me and I just said, "Let me know the time and place and I'll be ready," and walked away from him. He went to see his old boss the next day and make all the plans. Carl, the boss, had agreed to pay my dad half the money now so we could pay the rent and get out of debt, and the other half when I handed the baby over after it was born. As much as I wasn't looking forward to the whole childbirth thing, the worst of it all was having to sleep with Carl. I shuddered every time I thought about it, but I knew with a guy that old, it would likely be over pretty quickly, or at least I observed that from the movies. So the big day approached. We had, of course, calculated when my most fertile day would be on an ovulation chart. I wanted to get this right the first time. There was no way I was doing this more than once. So the day came, and it was as I thought. Awkward, gross, and quick. I sat on his bed. He asked me to take my clothes off, although I only took my bottoms off, and it was over in less than 5 minutes. I didn't know what was coming in regards to what it would be like to actually be pregnant for 9 months and then give birth to it. but I was just glad that part was over. My pregnancy was pretty uneventful in the end. I was a little sick at the beginning, but that went away. I kept going to school and did all my regular activities. One day I thought I'd had an accident, but it turned out my water broke. My labor was quick, and I had a healthy girl to hand over to Carl and his wife. After that, my life was my own. The money had given me the freedom I always wanted. To watch more animated story videos like this, hit that subscribe button. And tell us in the comments section what you thought about this story.